Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's Gas Resource Management meeting to discuss the straw proposal, which was published on July 25th. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. Just a reminder that today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And please remember to keep comments professional and respectful today, and brief as well. As you may have noticed, there are some new features on the WebEx today. The raised hand icon is now directly at the bottom of your screen. And if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device to join the queue. And there's also a new Inteller transparency view at the bottom right to see other attendees on the call. Be sure to refresh it prior to viewing. And closed captioning is also now available by clicking the CC button on the bottom left of your screen. And as always, please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And you can also send in comments and questions via chat to all panelists or directly to myself. And if you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to Inteller Events, the producer. And so with that, I will turn things over to Sylvie Buick to get us started on discussing the straw proposal.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone. First, I wanted to just acknowledge that the materials are put out a little bit later than standard. I'm hopeful that nothing you see today is new or a big surprise, given that we just converted the straw proposal into a PowerPoint for today's discussion. But if you have any additional questions or need clarification on anything, feel free to chime in here or reach out to me and Danny so that we can help. So today we're talking about the Gas Resource Management straw proposal. The straw proposal we put out represents a set of enhancements that we are confident are feasible in the near term. And we wanted to choose a set of enhancements that we thought we could do in the near term because stakeholders indicated a need to have something in place to support new EDAM participants as well as EIM only participants that expect to see changes in economic real-time participation. So we are confident that what is in the straw proposal will be elements that can be available as entities on board. We are open to continuing stakeholder discussions in a phase 2 around some of the more resource-intensive recommendations that we heard from stakeholders. So I have a slide at the end where I'll go through some of those and talk about what we might look for to continue those discussions. Quick overview of the schedule. We're getting close to the finish line for a draft final proposal. Between now and then, we'd like to see some comments by August 26th. And we have a market surveillance committee meeting scheduled for September 19th. And you'll see that I put a phase 2 as a second line on this chart, which is something that we will be seeking stakeholder feedback on prioritization for next steps. All right, so I heard from some stakeholders that it would be useful to review why we put the effort into the particular topics and solutions that are in this paper. So quick overview of where we've been and how we got here. We heard from stakeholders that differences in gas and electric market timelines can create challenges for gas resource operators. And there's two pieces of this puzzle. First is quantity uncertainty. By the time the day-ahead market results get published, the timely gas nomination cycle has already concluded. So gas resources are participating in the next day gas day without perfect visibility into what procurement targets are. There's also an element of price uncertainty. The market dispatch is based on bids that might represent the cost of gas already procured, but a lot of gas resources may not know their full costs by the time they submit bids. So the main challenge that we heard from stakeholders is that resources end up submitting bids before they know what the cost of revising their nominations might be. And usually, or our expectation is, a resource should account for this uncertainty through market-based offers in whatever way they deem appropriate. But the ISO also uses reference levels, which are an estimate of cost-based offers in lieu of supply offers to protect against market power. And when the ISO uses reference levels to proxy a resource's costs in the market, we want to make sure that resources still have all of their costs covered. So during the working groups, we talked about two broad areas for solutioning. The first has to do with visibility into procurement targets. Without enough visibility or certainty around what your commitments are going to look like and what those procurement targets are during the timely gas nomination cycle, we heard that gas resources may have to rely more heavily on evening and intraday gas cycles. While this isn't a new problem, we've heard that it might be particularly important now, given that market participants joining EDAM do not currently have information about or experience with being in the full footprint supply stack and being dispatched to serve the broader regional market footprint. We've also heard that stakeholders view that knowing with 100% certainty around what fuel procurement needs would look like could virtually eliminate most of the problems that they face during the evening and intraday gas cycles. And while 100% certainty is not a realistic target, we also have tools to help manage those challenges, which brings us to problem statement 2, which is that gas resources face a number of challenges when they have to rely on evening and intraday gas cycles to secure fuel supply. A consequence of this problem, if incremental fuel outside of your nominations puts your imbalances outside of unmanageable range, you may have to look for incremental nominations, the cost of which might be higher than what the next day gas index looked like. Or you might have to search out an alternative fuel supply if there's too much illiquidity or volatility in the market. So the straw proposal tries to address the root cause, which is the lack of visibility into procurement targets, as well as the challenges with managing evening and intraday gas cycles through these two sets of enhancements. First, we're going to talk about enhancements to the ISO's multi-day ahead market processes. These are processes that provide advisory information to inform fuel procurement. Next, we're going to talk about enhancements to reference levels, cost adjustments, and after the fact market cost recovery processes, which are tools that exist today to ensure that resources have a way to update their reference levels. So the proposals in this section are intended to ensure that these existing tools are sufficiently flexible and customizable for all regional market participants. I'll also spend a few minutes talking about some additional options that we discussed during the working groups around managing gas system limitations, like operational flow order notifications. The straw proposal mentions the ISO's proposal for a streamlined process for entities to explore the applicability and the value of a gas nomogram constraint, which is a tool that we use for reliability. However, stakeholders recommended some additional solutions for market-based approaches to make it more efficient to manage gas system limitations in the market. And we'll discuss the implications of those and next steps at the end of this presentation. All right, starting off with informing fuel procurement. The objective of existing policy is to publish 2-day ahead advisory results, 2-day ahead participating scheduling coordinators for their responsible gas generators. And we do this today through a RUC look ahead process that's run as part of the IFM. In the scoping and alignment meeting and also in the straw proposal, I dig further into the difference between this RUC look ahead that we use today and the D+2 market run that we'll use after EDAM go live. But because we've talked about it a few times, I didn't prepare an in-depth discussion of what those two differences look like in this presentation, but I have some slides in the appendix if anyone wants to take a pause and slow down and revisit that. The objectives of enhancements to the D+2 market run is to reach a reasonable level of confidence in multi-day ahead advisory information so that scheduling coordinators can use this information to inform fuel procurement. Again, we can't reach 100% certainty, but we do want to at least reduce over-reliance on intraday gas that causes some of the more extreme economic and reliability issues. And we want to give resources more flexibility to manage their gas procurement strategy the way that works best for them. And as we go through this, I just wanted to put a couple of questions up front that we'll be looking for feedback on. For example, what does it mean to reach a reasonable level of confidence? Does it mean reaching megawatts within 95% confidence? And another big question that's outstanding is, how do we best improve the bid set that we're using to inform the 2-day ahead advisory? Features of the straw proposal. You'll find 3 major things in the straw proposal under informing fuel procurement. First, an assessment of the expected accuracy of the D+2 advisory market results. I say expected because there are some limitations to the assessment that we can do today. Second, proposed enhancements to the D+2 market run that are intended to more closely align D+2 advisory results with the D+1. Finally, some proposals to provide day-ahead participating scheduling coordinators with more granular multi-day ahead advisory results than we can offer today. Before forging forth, I put together this slide because this has caused a great deal of confusion and consternation with people that I've talked to so far. And I also think that this is a useful standard for shorthand, especially if you started digging into the EDAM BRS. This is what our technology teams use, so I wanted to just level set quickly. Today, there's a D+2 market run. So that's a market run that forecasts tomorrow's day ahead market for the next day's real-time trade day. But there's also a day ahead market run. These are 2 separate and distinct processes that are giving us results for 2 separate trade days. I usually associate the D+2 with the D+1. So today's D+2 is the advisory for tomorrow's day ahead market, which I'll refer to as the D+1. And our goal is to make sure the D+2 and the D+1 align as closely as possible in terms of the inputs and the outputs. The D+2 and the DA are 1 day off in terms of the relevant trade day, and I've illustrated that on the next slide. Starting with the left-hand side, let's say today's date is the 12th, which it is. If today, the 12th, we have a D+2, that D+2 is giving us advisory results for the D+1 that will run on August 13th. Which is giving us our binding commitments for the real-time trade day on the 14th. And then if you look at the right-hand side, today is the 12th, and on the 12th, we also have a day ahead market, which I'll refer to as the DA. So you can see the difference between tomorrow's D+1 and today's DA. They're associated with 2 different real-time trade dates, and they should have different inputs. Any questions about that before we continue? It's just a language convention. You'll get used to it, I promise. It'll make your life so much easier.
Do you have a hand raised by Alva?
Alva.
Sylvie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. It's probably too much for here, but where would the inputs be characterized? I'm assuming that there's some bid duplication, but that some data is being updated by CAISO. Is there a descriptive a description of what data is used in these, particularly in the prospective D+2 as well as currently, but I'm more concerned about what you're going to be using in the new design.
Yeah, so the reason why we've switched to the D+2 is because currently we are using today's day ahead, so the DA on the right-hand side, to proxy the D+2.
Right.
That's the nature of the RUC look ahead, is that we're using the day ahead today and the inputs of the day ahead today. So we'll be switching to the D+2 after EDAM go live, which represents the D2 on 8/12 here. And that will use all of the inputs for the applicable trade day if they're available. So for the D+2 on 8/12, we would use forecasts for 8/14. We would use any bid information that we have available, hopefully, by that time. But one of the questions in the straw proposal is what to do if we don't have that information yet.
Okay. So it's not
there's
fully,
other
fully
D+2 coordination efforts that are ongoing to make sure that we iron out exactly what the inputs and the assumptions are for the D+2.
Okay, but prospectively it would be a full, people would put in their best information in order to provide the best take at a market estimate for that day. It's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, that seems to be the optimal outcome, especially given that the D+2 will use inputs, all the other inputs for the right trade day. So ideally, we would align the bid information with that trade day as well.
We shall presumably have some backup processes because some people may not feel obligated to put bids in.
Exactly, and that's something that we'll want to get input into on how to, what assumptions we should make around missing bids.
Great, thank you very much.
We also have a hand raised. Oh, looks like it's just lowered. Michelle, if you wanted to raise your hand again, feel free to. Oh, there we go. Michelle Tovar-Mora.
So the goal for here is for the confidence level for the D+2, D+1 to have a higher certainty for when we enter in the gasket on the procurement side of things. We rely more on the day ahead market than the real time.
The goal of enhancements to the D+2 is to provide better info. Sorry, I can hear you. An echo, if you don't mind muting yourself. Thanks, Michelle. The goal of enhancements to the D+2 is to create a better aligned market run with the D1 so that we can provide information that hopefully forecasts the D1 well. We want to provide information to inform fuel procurement, so create more confidence in using that information to inform fuel procurement. And as part of that, and I'll go to the next slide, part of that process is going to be to show how accurate the D+2 can be at forecasting D1 energy schedules. We also did this D2 assessment in order to identify opportunities for you to tell us where we can make tweaks to the D+2 model to make it a better and more valuable tool for informing fuel procurement. Does that answer your question, Michelle?
Yeah, that answers my question. And maybe just a follow-up to this. When those awards happen on day ahead, what's the confidence level that they'll actually dispatch those units and not offset that in EIM if the prices changes, if there's overgen? Because I think that's what we see right now. Sometimes we end up procuring day ahead for various reasons, not EDAM necessarily, but in EIM, when there's overgen, they dispatch down a lot of the units. That causes an imbalance, and maybe not the procurement, but there could be losses on the gas side of things. Might be part of this or another conversation, but what's the confidence level that those bids awards will actually get dispatched?
Great question. And we started thinking in that direction when we put together the analysis. So the takeaways I'll talk about today don't directly address that question, but we did get stakeholder feedback to think about how accurate the D+2 is relative to real time. So the analysis in the straw proposal, and you'll have to check the appendix for this, but we put a full discussion of this in the appendix. The analysis in the appendix of the straw proposal includes a comparison to real time and discusses what the implications might be for gas generators. I think that to tee up the discussion you're looking for, Michelle, we'll want more engagement from stakeholders around what the question is that we're looking for. I think the conclusion that the ISO provides in the straw proposal is that while D+2 to day ahead goes in one direction, so energy schedules tend to go down between D+2 and day ahead. They go back up between day ahead and real time, and RUC moves in the opposite direction. In theory, that's the role of RUC, to adjust for potential differences. But I'd like to hear more about what EIM only entities are looking for from D+2 market results.
Michelle, kind of adding on to the answer Sylvie gave, as more entities join the EDAM, the day ahead scheduling gets more efficient, and there is the potential for less deviations as you move into real time because you're co-optimizing all of the unit commitment in the day ahead time frame between the ISO BA and any other potential EDAM BAA. So there's always going to be differences, obviously, between the day ahead and the WEIM due to the temporal differences. But as more entities join the market, hopefully the unit commitment gets more efficient and the differences become more due to just the temporal aspect.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time, Sylvie.
All right, then we can forge ahead. I'll talk a little bit more about the D+2 enhancement, the D+2 assessments, and the D+2 coordination efforts. We are trying to use this D+2 assessment to do a couple of things to improve your confidence in using this information, to identify opportunities for improvement, and also to establish a benchmark for continued analysis. I thought SDG&E had a great idea in their comments. They recommended formalizing a go-live plan for continued analysis to continue to support enhancements to the D+2 model, as well as other proposals that might help inform fuel procurement. So a quick overview of the analysis that we did. The question we asked is, how well can the D+2 market run predict D1 results? And what we found is that the D+2 appears to be a reasonably accurate forecast of D1 energy schedules for gas resources. And on the next slide, I'll show you that we observed about 95% accuracy most of the time. There's some other observations. If you look at the differences between D2, D1, and real-time RUC, for example, we see advisory energy schedules tend to be significantly more accurate than advisory RUC awards. And because of this, the ISO is proposing to provide gas resources with not just the advisory RUC schedules, but with separate market awards. So we'll give you advisory energy schedules, advisory RUC awards, as well as imbalance reserves and the other market components. We also saw that daily variance indicates a potential challenge. So while we are seeing a pretty good amount of accuracy between the D+2 and the D1, that doesn't necessarily hold on specific days throughout the month or throughout the year, which presents an opportunity for finding solutions. This is what we saw when we did the preliminary analysis. What we did was we looked at gas resources in the CAISO BA. We necessarily had to limit this analysis to gas resources in the CAISO BA because those are the only gas resources that participate day ahead and for which we have D2 data. We calculated the average gas burn for the fleet in aggregate, and looked at how the daily gas burn for the fleet in the D+2 compares to the gas burn for the fleet in the D+1. And from this, what you can see is that there are a couple of small periods of deviations, but for the most part, it looks like the D+2 is a pretty good estimate of D+1 gas burn. I put a few
And Sylvia,
additional, yeah.
I was just going to
Go
add
for
in
it,
that
Danny.
the intent of this element of the proposal is just to give scheduling coordinators a good idea of what their expected positioning would be within the day ahead. We understand each scheduling coordinator has their own fuel procurement strategy and their own hedging strategy, but the ask we heard is, where could we be within the day ahead dispatch? And so what you're showing here is that the D2 is a pretty good indicator. It's never going to be perfect, obviously, but at least a reasonable starting point to inform those strategies.
Sylvie, we did just get a raised hand if you wanted to take a moment or.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, happy to.
Darren Anderson, go ahead.
Thanks for the question, Sylvie. Appreciate it, or the presentation, Sylvie. Appreciate it. Did you guys try and do any external modeling for gas resources outside of California? Was there any sort of modeling? Because my fear here is that you've got pretty good synchronization between your D+2 and your D1 gas burns, but the reality is I kind of want to see, I guess, maybe more information and modeling with a broader footprint with some variance in fueling. And so I didn't know if you guys did take a look at that.
We would love to do that too. There are way too many variables at this point to think about. Not only do we want to look at how this will look for regional gas market participants, but also the market itself, the market design itself will be changing in a few significant ways with EDAM Go Live. So it's not just about modeling for regional market participants, but also modeling those changes in market participation. One of the big ones is the introduction of imbalance reserves, which we expect and is designed to significantly reduce the use of manual load conformance, which can impact RUC, and that directly impacts the accuracy of D+2 with respect to D+1. So there are a lot of things that we expect to change, which is why this is just a preliminary effort, and we do expect to continue to do this analysis once we get more data.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
And maybe I can plug that the first opportunity for more data will likely be in parallel ops. So you don't have to wait for EDAM Go Live. We'll start looking at data as soon as it comes out of the market. So just to summarize the enhancements that we're thinking about and planning on for informing fuel procurement, we propose to provide scheduling coordinators with more granular data, like the advisory energy schedules separated from advisory RUC awards. We also plan to make some enhancements to improve the inputs and modeling assumptions. The ISO is already planning on using the latest forecasts and outage information available, but we also want to better align the bid set with that information, as I just chatted with Alva. So the proposal on the table is to use the bid set for the D1 if it's already been submitted by the market participant. If not, we would consider using day ahead bids. So that would be bids for the same day's day ahead market, 1 day off, or a historic bid set. So that would be bids from, say, a week ago. And the reason why we're putting this out there for stakeholder feedback is because there could be implications to using either of those bid sets. One of the reasons that came to mind for me is that these bid sets represent different days of the week, and especially for gas resources, the day of the week might be important. So this just shows the different opportunities for which bid set we might want to use and the potential for inconsistency with respect to the day of the week. So if we want to inform the D+2 on Sunday, the optimal bid set would be, sorry, if we want to inform the D+2 for Monday, the optimal bid set would be the D1 for Monday. If we do not have bids yet for the D1 for Monday, then our options are the day ahead for Sunday, so that's that first column all the way on the left, or historic bids from Monday a week ago. Our market operators generally have a preference for consistency and simple rules, but we're open to feedback on what will best inform the D+2. Any questions about how I set this up? I told you the DA versus D1 would be important.
We have a couple questions, first from Stuart Kelly.
Hi, Stuart.
Some feedback from this group. I think this has been probably one of the better work streams.
Stuart, could you get a little closer to your mic? It's a little bit difficult to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I appreciate what this working group's done. I think it's by far the best working group, and what the tools have developed or are developing. I would love to get feedback from this group in terms of if we moved in a direction to require bidding for the D+2 run without that information getting made available that folks could game it in some way, but require bidding and require self-scheduling, because not only would that improve the gas forecasting, I love the direction that we're moving potentially from D+2 to 1.5 to further improve those confidence levels, but it has a material impact on the reliability runs the market's looking to do. And I think if we could get that information, it benefits gas, it benefits reliability, and we're way better off with it. So most of the systems we use automatically generate these bids by and large, and it's not too difficult to do that as long as the necessary safeguards are in. So I would just love feedback or whether there's concerns by requiring that.
I think that from my perspective, we would agree that the better bid set we have, the better the outcomes are going to be. I'm hopeful that by providing this new stream of data and this tool, that at least provides a stronger incentive for resources to engage and give us better information ahead of time. We can always put the question out there for stakeholders on what the temperature is for having a stricter rule about requiring bids ahead of time. I'd have to do some research on what the precedent is, but I appreciate the thought.
Thanks. Next. Oh, go
Stuart, kind of just adding on, there might be an RA tie-in about when the offers are due for California ISO VA market participants that would have to be modified. But the broader question is, do we think if we had a requirement, there's a meaningful financial hook that would incentivize accurate bidding beyond just right now, if the systems are pumping up bids a couple of days in advance and we're getting those, we're going to use them and the results are going to be more accurate. Would a deadline, which I don't think we'd be opposed to, improve the end result of getting accurate bids in that D+2 timeframe?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Danny. And then that leads into, well, if you need stronger incentives, you weigh the pros and cons of multi-day settlement. It's something that we've contemplated, but there's maybe a stretch too far at the moment. But anything we can do to get that better bid set, particularly there'll still be a lot of self-scheduling required and needed by the EDAM entities that we need to factor in. And I don't know if necessarily CAISO's got a good proxy for for that and what it means. But just a thought, anyway. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart.
But to your point too, like we can plan to put a question in the comment template asking for additional stakeholder feedback on this exact kind of proposal that you're putting forward.
Thank you. And next in the queue, we had Steve Keen, but I think your hand went down. Steve, feel free to raise your hand again if you still had a question. All right, looks like no further questions at this time.
All right. So just wrapping up this section, again, we've got a couple of proposals in here. There's one more proposal that I'll talk about a little bit later on that relates to the D+2, but is somewhat different. The philosophy there is that we can get as far as we can with improving your confidence in this information, improving the accuracy of it, but we don't have a crystal ball. So insofar as we can't get perfect information, the flip side of the coin would be to hedge the potential for information to be less accurate. So I'll talk about that later in the next section. Accommodating cost variation. I have heard from stakeholders that it might be useful to do a quick refresher on the bidding rules, reference levels, and cost adjustment processes that we're talking about today. So I'll do that. I've got some of the gas price analysis that we talk about in the STRAW proposal. I'll walk through some of the proposals in the paper and talk about the process that we are offering to work with the ISO on potential cyber changes to make it easier to submit automated cost adjustment requests. First, a refresher on bidding rules and the existing tools for updating reference levels. Resources can incorporate their fuel procurement strategy in market-based offers. Remember, you can offer anything through your energy bid. Standard practice across centralized markets that resources are expected to manage their fuel procurement strategy through economic bidding. And this has been reinforced by FERC precedent. FERC says that they also have an expectation that resources should manage challenges associated with fuel procurement through bidding. And so we want to make sure that you can do that as well. Resources should be able to ensure their reference levels also accurately reflect cost-based offers in case bids are subject to mitigation. And so today we have two ways of doing this. First, scheduling coordinators will work with the ISO to identify their preference of reference level calculation and their opportunities to customize that reference level calculation so that it best correlates with costs. The second way to do this is to accommodate infrequent cost variation by leveraging the reference level change request process and the after the fact cost recovery process. The idea behind reference level calculations is that the ISO will never have perfect information. Generators will have better information than the ISO. So our goal is to make sure reference levels are a reasonable benchmark for your cost-based offers to the extent that, and do so to the extent that resources don't have to rely on cost adjustments frequently. In other words, your reference level should strongly correlate with your costs throughout the year. Today, a scheduling coordinator can choose from multiple standard options, which include an LMP option, a registered cost option, variable cost, and negotiated cost options. For default energy bids for gas resources, we typically see variable cost and negotiated cost options. However, there's only one option today, the proxy cost option for your default commitment cost. There are some opportunities for scheduling coordinators to negotiate parameters like variable O&M, but this isn't as flexible as the options that we have for DEBs. When cost adjustments are necessary, all resources should have access to a similar level of flexibility. What this means is that if your reference levels are not a reasonable benchmark, if your reference levels systematically differ from your actual costs or don't have a strong correlation with your actual costs, that's actually going to impact the amount of flexibility you have to update your reference levels in the market. So it's really important to get the benchmark right, because getting that benchmark right will unlock the amount of flexibility intended by the cost adjustment process. The reference level change request process, which is our cost adjustment process for reference levels, has two options that scheduling coordinators can use to update the ISO with their actual and expected costs before the market runs. Both of these options have the same information requirement and the same standard of conduct. I believe I put in the appendix of this presentation a screenshot from Business Practice Manuals Attachment 0.1 for reference level change requests, specifically of the standard of conduct, which is that we expect to see prudent procurement, prudent procurement practices and practices that avoid jeopardizing pipeline or electric reliability, practices that reflect best practices consistent with industry norms. So that's the standard by which we define how much flexibility you have and what you get to reflect in your reference levels. That's the standard that we use that's the standard that we expect for the information you retain to support reference level changes. So when you request a reference level, you should have documentation to support that change, but the process for review for each of these options looks different. For the manual process, the ISO will manually review documentation that shows support of your cost adjustment. The automated process uses the reference level uses the reasonableness threshold to screen requests. Whatever information you put into Cyber, it compares to the value that is your reasonableness threshold and then automatically accepts or caps that request at the reasonableness threshold. This means that there's no review of your documentation at that time. We just use the reasonableness threshold as a screen, but any requests through the automated process are subject to audit. And in either case, whatever the requested amount was, even if the ISO doesn't approve the full amount, you are eligible for cost recovery for amounts requested. The cost recovery process will determine whether or not those costs are actually incurred versus expected. A reminder of what all of these levels look like. By default, we give you a safe harbor multiplier. So on energy bids, we multiply your reference level by 110%. And that 110% represents a safe harbor to accommodate any variation between what information the ISO knows and has access to and what actual costs might happen. The reasonableness threshold is driven by this fuel volatility scalar, which defines the range within which the ISO and stakeholders have previously determined is a reasonable range to request cost adjustments for volatility. This is the range in which we've seen most gas price volatility occur and which we've determined represents competitive conduct without having to review your documentation. The manual cost adjustment request does require that you provide documentation reviewed by the ISO, and we'd be looking for a PQ pair to review. Frequently asked question. This has come up in a couple of different spaces, not just this working group process. So I did want to address this directly. How does the reference level change request process work for expected costs? The ISO explicitly allows expected costs, not just known and actual costs, to be included in the automated reference level requests. This is because we understand that you may not know your full cost when you're bidding into the market. And requests within the range of the reasonableness threshold represent, quote, competitive conduct, but we do limit it for a reason. We limit it because this is based on expected costs and not yet actual costs. Again, I will reference you to the BPM, which describes the documentation that we require for this, and it also tells you what happens if your costs change after you make this request. While you are subject to audit, the ISO will look at what information you knew and when. So if information changes after you can change your costs again based on new information, the ISO will just look for evidence that a scheduling quarter made a good faith attempt to revise those reference levels after new information became available. And my colleague Mahir and I put together a short example that we're hoping can both show you how you can use either process to reflect expected costs and to illustrate what the policy difference between these processes are. Either process can be leveraged to reflect expected cost differences. So the example here is that your default energy bid equals 11, and I chose the most simple values that I could. So while I know this doesn't represent a realistic cost, bear with me. Default energy bid equals 11, which means your reasonableness threshold might be 14. And that means you could request a cost adjustment through the automated process for anything up to 14. Imagine so far your fuel has cost $13 through nominations in the next day gas day. But by the end of the day, you think your costs will be $16 when you have to purchase incremental nominations during the intraday cycles. So prior to the close of the bid window for the day-ahead market, what options do you have? First, the question is, what supporting documentation do you have? In scenario 1, let's say you have documentation that shows that you tried to purchase fuel at $15 during the next day gas day, but were rejected. And the business practice manuals describes how you can show this to the ISO. If you have documentation that shows you tried to purchase fuel at $15 and were rejected, that's an indication to us that that we expect your cost to be at least $15 moving into real time. So you can use the automated process, and the automated process will cap requests at 14. And remember, we're not looking at your documentation through that process. Or you can show the ISO this proof of attempted fuel purchase, and the manual process can approve costs up to $15. In scenario 2, let's say you purchased most of your fuel at $13 again, and you expect that you'll need to rely on intraday fuel or intraday cycles to nominate additional capacity. But you don't have this proof that you tried to purchase fuel at $15. Without that proof, you wouldn't be able to support a manual request of $15, which means the automated process would be your best option. Any questions about this?
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this time. And just a reminder, folks, if you're having trouble raising your hand, you can always send in your questions via chat.
The main point here is that you have options. The best option for you might depend on what information you have and you know at the time. In either case, the ISO does want you to make your best effort and best faith attempt to update us with your cost information, whether known or expected. And to reinforce that incentive, the ISO has this after the fact cost recovery process. And this is different from a FERC filing, which I understand is costly and burdensome. The ISO's streamlined process is more analogous to getting bid cost recovery through the ISO. It's a streamlined process that accounts for costs not recoverable through the market. You get to recover costs that you requested through the reference level change request process, which is why it's important to at least make the attempt to request them, even if you expect that it'll be capped. And I do want to note that this is a separate parallel process as a filing with filing at FERC. What I mean by that is you can request cost recovery through the ISO or through a FERC filing, or both if you want, but they have the exact same standards for information requirements and review. So you should not expect a different outcome for either. So all of this in concert gives us a pretty robust toolkit that offers multiple opportunities for you to fine-tune your reference levels, request cost adjustments, and ensure that you're getting cost recovery after the fact if necessary. I saw a quick question that I think we should address now. Let me see it.
Yeah, did you want me to read it?
Yes, I got it. Does the fuel volatility
okay.
scaler apply to the DEB? So the NDEB, the negotiated DEB process is a process that a responsible entity for a gas resource goes into with DMM and the ISO. And it could result in that process determining a fuel volatility scaler, but there's no rules or requirements around that. It's not a given that an NDEB would end up having a fuel volatility scaler, but that's up to the resource and how that process plays out. That's a really good question, though, because we will get to some of the proposals in this paper, which may not apply to an NDEB. First, quick review of what we saw in the gas price analysis. The gas price analysis in the straw proposal looked at how well threshold values accommodate requests based on expected costs. This seems to be a theme. We want to make sure that you can request your expected cost to a reasonable extent through the automated reference level change request process, which means based on next day gas indices, we'd want to see most volatility between next day and same day covered by our default threshold values. So that's 110 for DEBs and 125% for commitment costs. And we'd want to see most volatility or variation covered by the reasonableness thresholds. We were also looking for patterns that might tell us what type of enhancements we should be considering. For example, should we do regional adjustments to the reasonableness threshold or hub-specific adjustments? Does it make sense to give resources more flexibility in certain months or different seasons? Does this analysis support triggering more flexibility based on some observable trigger? First, we looked at how this plays out on average. So what we're looking at here is the percentage difference between next day and same day prices as a percentage of next day, averaged over the month. A negative change means that next day indices would have underestimated same day indices. For example, let's look at Kern delivery. That outlier you see on the far left, I think that's March 2021. On that day, we are observing that the same day index was on average about 30% greater than next day indices over that month. So what we saw based on this analysis is that there actually aren't any systematic problems. All of the average variation we're seeing can at least be accounted for through the automated reference level change request process. But of course, this does not rule out infrequent outliers or even frequent variation. So we looked at variance, and what we see is that there's a lot more variance around volatility between next day and same day when we look at each day of the month. So now each month is represented by a box and whisker plot, and you can see variation in both directions. So sometimes the next day gas day overestimates same day prices, and sometimes it underestimates same day prices. What this told the ISO, though, is that maybe there's no obvious specific seasonal adjustment we can make or hub-specific adjustment we can make, but this does seem to support the direction that stakeholders recommended that we go in, which is developing targeted enhancements and potentially resource-specific enhancements. For targeted enhancements, we wouldn't see, we don't necessarily see whether any of that variation is correlated or has a causal relationship with some of the things that stakeholders have pointed out. We also don't necessarily see how a specific resource would fare in these instances. Analysis at the hub level doesn't necessarily show us that volatility tends to impact different resources to different extents, and a resource might encounter a constraint that prevents it from accessing fuel at some price. So we want to acknowledge that those things can hold true and make sure we have enhancements that facilitate more resource-specific adjustments when warranted. I'm going to move on from the gas price analysis unless anyone wants to discuss it further.
I just received a hand from Darren Anderson. Go ahead, Darren.
Thanks again, Sylvie. I think in your analysis, you probably should look at Sumas. I know that we all know it's the most extreme price point that we have volatility at in the West, but it's a reality for us in the Pacific Northwest that we have to endure that point. And it's with a heavy burden that we do. So anyways, just food for thought.
I totally understand. And we saw that in comments that we should look at Sumas. We tried. However, there's not enough real-time there's not enough same-day index data for us to use. My colleague Mahir is on. He's actually the one that looks at all of the ICE data and does this analysis, so he can chime in if he has more to say on that point. But it's not that we didn't want to, it's just that we couldn't give you a complete analysis there. I think from a policy perspective, that doesn't preclude supporting enhancements for resources that are plugged in at Sumas. In fact, I think all of the enhancements that we propose in the straw proposal still work because it doesn't require that we rely on observed hub data. It requires that we look at purchase data.
Yeah, it's me here. And I can add to what Sylvie said. We did look at the analysis. We did do the analysis on Sumas. You just end up seeing a lot of months that it's just blank. There's no same day data there for you to compare it to next day. But we did look at it. We did do the analysis. We did see what the trends are.
Did we look at? I know we say Sumas and we use that interchangeably with Huntington up there. Did we look on the Canadian side to see actively what's being traded on a real-time basis there? Because Sumas has much less liquidity on the U.S. side.
Yeah, we did, Darren. We looked at any of the hubs that have same-day pricing, and we saw a similar trend in that hub on the other side of the border there with Sumas. So these hubs that you're seeing on the analysis are the ones that had consistent same-day trading that made it worth sort of putting onto a slide. Again, we did the analysis for that other hub that you're mentioning too, and more beyond those. We did an analysis for all the hubs that have had same-day trading, but we only selected the ones that had sufficient trading for purposes of sharing it in this workshop.
And I appreciate that. Thanks for the color.
And I think one of the key points I'd like to emphasize is that we don't view this analysis as a decisional item, as a stop or go on whether or not we pursue enhancements to facilitate accommodating more volatility or flexibility at the hubs. Which is why we continue down the road of finding enhancements that can be supported in some other way besides looking at the analysis from the ISO's perspective.
And I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time, Sylvie.
Well, that brings us then to a set of 3 enhancements that I've grouped together. that all sort of get to the same objective that we've heard from stakeholders. So we have these three proposals: a configurable GPI fuel multiplier, a negotiated fuel cost option, and a blended fuel region. All three of these proposals have the same objectives. They are applicable to both the default reference levels, so the DEB and the commitment cost, as well as the reasonableness threshold to provide consistency between what gets accommodated by default and how much flexibility you have. Also, we wanted to provide consistency between the fuel cost you're able to reflect through your default energy bid and the fuel cost you're able to reflect through commitment costs. We heard from stakeholders that we really need to develop a way to capture cost from multiple potential sources of fuel or multiple fuel hubs. So each of these proposals has a way of doing that. And each of them are supported by resource-specific fuel cost information instead of the ISO's observation of gas price indices. To address Darren's last concern, this is how we make these policies work where we don't have enough fuel information on same-day indices. There are some differences between these three proposals. Some of them are going to come out in implementation, and again, my colleague Mihir can jump in when we start to talk about that. But I think that from a procedural perspective, that's where the differences are most important, because we heard that stakeholders were concerned about the onerousness of another negotiated option. And many stakeholders, as an alternative, as a way to relieve the potential resource commitment that negotiating an option might represent, many stakeholders suggested that we discuss a blended fuel region. To make things even easier, we are proposing this configurable GPI multiplier, which I view as the simplest option here, and it preserves your flexibility to switch active fuel regions that you have in the master file. The negotiated fuel cost option is a way to get basically a negotiated commitment cost, since we heard that it would be useful to extend that functionality from DEBs today. This offers the most customization, but also would require the most engagement from the requesting market participant. Finally, we have the blended fuel region option. I've posed a couple of questions in the straw proposal and in this presentation to help us better flesh out what this policy is going to look like. So I don't really have my assessment of the procedural value here, because I think it needs to be a little bit better defined through the stakeholder process first. First, let's talk about the configurable fuel region multiplier. This proposal is based on existing policy, and I've got a few details on that existing policy in the appendix of this presentation. The existing policy is called Adjustments for Persistent Conditions. And when we adjust for persistent conditions, what the ISO does is that it observes fuel costs that are recovered through the after-the-fact cost recovery process. And if those costs are systematically greater than a resource's reference levels, the ISO will determine a multiplier value and attach that to that resource's reasonableness threshold to give it more flexibility to recover those costs in the market. So this proposal extends that idea to make it proactive instead of reactive. We wanted to provide a way for you to request that we do this analysis before you end up having to recover these costs after the market. This is beneficial because not only does it avoid having to go through an aftermarket cost recovery process, but it can improve the efficiency of market outcomes. So under this proposal, the ISO would observe a resource's actual costs, and if they've historically and systematically differed from a specified gas index price, the ISO will calculate and apply an additional multiplier, which I'm calling an N value, to a resource's fuel region. We're proposing that this is applicable to a single fuel region that you have registered in the master file. And when that fuel region is active, reference levels will reflect that N value. We would do this by request. So a resource would have to tell the ISO that it would like us to assess their fuel costs compared to the gas price index and support that request with fuel cost information. Similar to the existing policy, involvement would otherwise be limited. So it would be send us a message and then go home, and the ISO would do the rest. And this is how we would apply that N value. By default, and in the reasonableness threshold, it appears in the same place as a multiplier on your gas price index within the fuel region. We've noted a few of the rules in the straw proposal, which align with current policy, and we're open to feedback on some of these details to inform implementation. So relevant to the question that came through the chat about whether the fuel volatility scalar applies to the NDEB, this is sort of a similar take where we can apply this multiplier to a resource's DEB if that's a variable cost DEB, because the variable cost DEB calculation includes that fuel region, which is informed by the master file. If a resource's DEB option does not include a fuel region that is informed by the master file, the N value won't show up. So we'll take a resource's DEB into consideration when we do this analysis. I'll also note that resources have the opportunity to rank their DEB option twice a year. So we're open to feedback on whether or not we need rules around reassessment or how often you can change your DEB option here. We are not proposing any changes. We have not proposed any changes to the ISO's process for assessing and setting this multiplier. Again, this aligns with the existing policy where the ISO does that assessment and comes up with that calculation without requiring back and forth with the resource. But we are open to feedback on what this assessment should look like. Any questions on that so far?
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this time.
All right. So we're hoping this provides a valuable alternative to the negotiated option. But now let's take a look at the negotiated option. So the negotiated process for commitment costs can look one of two ways. First, it can be a full-blown negotiated process for commitment costs. So this would give resources the opportunity to negotiate the entire formula with a lot of customizability. The second option is just a negotiated fuel cost parameter. So this would just be the fuel cost or the fuel region that you see show up in both the variable cost DEB and the proxy commitment cost calculation. Putting out there for stakeholder feedback if either of these options happens to be preferable for one reason or another. From the ISO's perspective, options 1 and 2 may have significantly different implementation burdens. So as we explore that, we can update stakeholders on whether or not one or another option might indicate speed bumps. Finally, we've got the blended fuel region. This is the option that stakeholders recommended we revisit. There are a myriad of ways that we could design this policy. Some questions that we're looking for stakeholders to answer include what is the appropriate methodology for coming up with the right index value? What granularity should we come up with a way to blend the fuel region. For instance, should we give you a value annually, seasonally, or 12 different values across the year? And what fuel hubs or fuel regions should the ISO consider when coming up with a blended fuel region for a resource? The ISO is recommending this this functionality as a benchmark, or at least a place to iterate on. We recommend this being a sort of plug and chug function where a resource can identify 2 fuel options that they have registered in the master file, provide us with volumetric cost information, and the ISO would come up with a weighted average based on those 2 fuel options and what we've seen your purchase history looks like for each month. And a market participant could provide us with this data annually, and we would come up with those 12 values and apply them for the rest of the year. This is another one where the devil is in the details when it comes to implementation and when it comes to the rules around it. So we are looking for a lot more stakeholder feedback to get this formula right, and more broadly on whether this option offers unique value compared to the prior 2 options we just discussed. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next set of proposals, the objective of which was somewhat different. So the set of proposals we just talked about were developed to help resources better reflect multiple fuel sources that they might source fuel from, create consistency between the DEB and commitment costs. But we've also talked about exceptional circumstances where resources expect to encounter more volatility and expect to need more flexibility to accommodate that volatility. We already have a couple of these types of policies. For instance, on Mondays, that indicates to us illiquid weekend trading, and so the ISO increases the reasonableness threshold every Monday. The ISO is proposing two policies based on this idea of giving you more flexibility in exceptional circumstances. The first one is based on forecast uncertainty, and I'll dig into that when we get to those slides. But based on forecast uncertainty, the ISO would increase the reasonableness threshold to give resources flexibility. The second one is a somewhat different approach where we would provide another option for accessing the after the fact cost recovery process when there is a physical supply disruption. Before going further, I wanted to acknowledge that a very popular stakeholder recommendation was that the ISO come up with some weather-triggered event where during anomalous cold weather or extreme weather conditions, the ISO would increase the reasonableness threshold to provide gas resources with more flexibility. So we did look for ways to support that in the analysis. The ISO has observed gas price volatility in winter months, but we can't further extrapolate based on that observation how that observed weather pattern might result in gas supply scarcity or gas system limitations in real time. In general, the ISO doesn't have great visibility into what might be driving gas volatility and when. And in those types of circumstances, the ISO normally relies on hearing from the gas pipeline what the appropriate recourse should be. For instance, we might get an alert from the gas pipeline to determine the need for ISO intervention. And I'll plug that in tomorrow's workshop that we're having on gas reliability, we'll have some of the gas ops people there to talk about what some of these procedures look like and the coordination around that. We did see a correlation between cost adjustments getting capped through the automated reference level change request process and events that we consider are characterized by uncertainty. And I saw in stakeholder comments that many stakeholders observe this too. It's not just about extreme weather, it's about unexpected extreme weather or the unexpected conditions that occur due to extreme weather. So given that takeaway, the ISO is proposing to provide more flexibility to request cost adjustments through the automated reference level change request process in response to forecast uncertainty. And this brings us back to what we were talking about around informing fuel procurement. We understand that gas resources may have to rely more heavily on evening and illiquid intraday gas cycles without enough confidence or visibility into what their commitments are going to be and what their procurement targets should be while they're still trading during the timely gas nomination cycle. So we do expect that all of the efforts we're putting into improving the D+2 should improve visibility and certainty most of the time, but obviously there's a limit to how much certainty we can offer. And so if we can't get you perfect certainty, this proposal aims to at least ensure against the impacts of uncertainty. A little bit of the analysis from the D+2 that we saw. So on the left-hand side, what that's showing is the average difference between the D+2 energy gas burn supporting energy schedules and the D1 gas burn supporting energy schedules. And we see that the D+2 typically underestimates, sorry, is it me here? Are we seeing an overestimate or underestimate here?
So it's 2 day ahead minus day ahead. So if it's negative
Yes.
2 day ahead is higher than the day ahead. And so on the right side, we're seeing in the red color where the 2 day ahead is less than day ahead, so it's negative. That's the median is negative. And the green color is where the median for the 2 day ahead is greater than the day ahead. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Mahir. So what we're seeing is that on average, these differences typically fall less than 10%, usually hover around 5%, if not less, but there's a lot more variation if you look at the variance across each month. So this proposal intends to address those instances in variation when when D2 market results may not align with the D1. So the ISO is proposing to increase the reasonableness threshold for both day-ahead and real-time reference levels when we observe higher than normal forecast uncertainty for the D+2. When we did this analysis, we talked about how there are a number of different drivers that can influence differences between the D2 and the D1. We understand that those are largely the bid set, which we're already talking about, outage information, which there isn't much we can do about, but then the third thing is this forecast uncertainty. So we're hopeful that giving generators more flexibility to reflect cost adjustments in anticipation of relying on intraday gas markets will cover a lot of the variability between D2 and D1 that we're seeing.
Can I add a little example here to try to illustrate the way we're thinking about this? It's really simplified, but the ISO calculates a distribution of uncertainty that it's procuring to with the imbalance reserve product. So the way you could implement this is we would calculate a P50 uncertainty of maybe 10. And then the normal P95 uncertainty is 14. And so we know the usual gap between those two is 4. If we are then seeing a P95 uncertainty of 18, to us, that would be a good indicator that there's a lot more uncertainty feeding into the forecast model, and that itself would become the trigger to provide additional uncertainty within reflecting reference costs. So that's a really simplified version, but the idea is the uncertainty of the uncertainty calculation itself.
The derivative of the uncertainty. This is what we propose this looks like in implementation. If the ISO observes higher than normal uncertainty going into the D+2, that is an indication for us that we expect a lot more generators are going to be relying on intraday markets, and therefore a lot more risk that cost could increase beyond what's in the next day gas day. And so the ISO proposes to calculate and apply an uncertainty scalar to the reasonableness threshold to facilitate those before market cost adjustments for expected intraday costs. Any questions about that? I feel like this is sort of a deeply conceptual proposal, but hopefully it strikes a chord with your experience. Not hearing anything, I'll go on to the next proposal. This is a new rule for after market cost recovery. Today, the reference level change request process is an important prerequisite to be eligible for the after the fact cost recovery process. You can only leverage the ISO's streamlined after the fact cost recovery process for amounts that you have requested pre-market. The ISO is proposing a new rule to allow resources to, instead of needing this prerequisite, in lieu of that, to offer proof of a physical supply disruption. The logic here is that you might not have known or thought to request a cost adjustment when a physical supply disruption doesn't come until it's too late to request a cost adjustment. The way that it's worded in this draft proposal is this middle 9. The ISO is proposing to allow resources to offer proof of physical supply disruption as a prerequisite for eligibility. And we're seeking stakeholder feedback to define this rule or define the details of this rule further if stakeholders think that it's warranted. We came up with a couple of examples of how we might further define this rule to make sure that it's clear what we mean by supply disruption. For example, we can say resources can offer proof of physical disruption as a prerequisite if that physical disruption occurs after the 8 a.m. manual deadline prior to the day-ahead market for a dual fuel resource. The logic here is that if there's a physical supply disruption and you need to rely on a different type of fuel, we would normally expect you use the manual reference level change request process to manage that. So if it happens after the manual deadline and you need to say rely on diesel fuel, you can use proof of a supply disruption to request cost recovery for that other fuel type. Now, if you're a gas resource that has alternative gas supply options, then we would accept proof of physical supply disruption after the close of the day-ahead window. And the difference here is that we would expect a resource, in this case, to request a cost adjustment through the automated process. Open to discussing these. Just put them on the table to offer options if stakeholders feel we need to more clearly define this proof of eligibility.
We did have a question in the chat. Did you want me to read it?
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Sure. From Hal Liu asking how to make the best decision on manual RLCR versus automated RLCR and % value on a configurable fuel region multiplier. Is N% determined by ISO, or is it manually requested by participants? They said it feels like these two overlay on each other.
The ISO is proposing that the ISO would determine what the N value would be for the configurable fuel region multiplier. In terms of the manual, like the decision between the automated and the manual process, that's always going to be up to the market participant. And I want to clarify that the manual reference level change request process does not have a multiplier associated with it. There's actually no limit or predetermined limit on the cost that you can request, or that I guess it's possible to get approved through the manual process. The limitation through the manual process is your ability to provide documentation that can show what your costs are. So I think that it's difficult to compare how your outcomes might change between the manual and the automated with an N value. The biggest difference is just one is limited by the reasonable threshold and the other is not. The primary objective here is with the N value and with each of the proposals for modifications to reference levels is to make sure that all resources across the footprint have the same access to flexibility for cost adjustments. So the values, the threshold values that exist today were based on an analysis that we did for the CAISO BA. And we've heard that resources outside of the CAISO BA might experience a lot more volatility and gas system constraints with some regularity. So the purpose of the N value here would be to better align how much the range of costs that your reference levels can accommodate with what policy intends that you have.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
Sylvie, can I add as well, just a reminder, on the manual, it is a highly time-sensitive process. That's the other part too. The automated can be submitted at any time up to the market close. The manual has to be submitted before 8 a.m. and it has to be processed in time for the market. And so that sort of adds additional constraint to sort of that decision when you want to submit a manual versus the automated. And the other thing to reiterate on as far as the policy design behind what a manual reference level request is really intended for, there's the policy design it's a tiered approach in the sense that, as you said, you will automatically get capped with the automated reference level change request, but the manual gives the additional room. And so really what that's saying is the manual should be used if the automated isn't enough. That's another way of describing it. So there's a lot of constraints here. It's not a clear answer, but I wanted to add these other points.
Hopefully that answered your question. All right, moving on. We heard stakeholders say that they'd like to see the actual process of submitting an automated reference level change request process be easier. This does not represent a policy change, so we aren't proposing anything specific in this draft proposal, but what we will be doing is providing an opportunity for any interested stakeholders to work with ISO client services and our technology teams to work in a test environment, to tell us more about what cyber functionality isn't working and to help us inform what changes have to be made. Two of the things that we've heard so far in this process is that stakeholders would find it valuable to be able to request cost adjustments for a group of resources at a single time, or to request cost adjustments at the fuel region level. Those are things that I have run by our technology teams, and they are excited to work with any of you that want to provide them with more details on how to do this. Final bucket of recommendations from stakeholders is managing gas system limitations. What we understand from stakeholders is that there's more limited imbalance capacity on regional gas pipelines, and one of the potential reasons is differences in infrastructure and differences in storage just reduce the amount of imbalance capacity available, and as a result, gas resources on these regional gas pipelines might experience more frequent limitations on using gas imbalance capacity, more frequent OFOs, and this can make it more difficult for them to manage imbalances and efficiently revise their positions in real time. Illiquid intraday trading can make it more expensive or even prohibitive to secure additional nominations. And this is an example of one of the challenges that we have been discussing throughout gas resource management, having to rely on intraday gas cycles in order to support to support commitments. But in this case, we've heard from stakeholders specific recommendations to figure out how to help us do this more efficiently. The ISO does have certain expectations in this area. Resources are responsible for taking appropriate action in response to gas system limitations to ensure that meeting their commitments and/or offering incremental energy does not result in unauthorized gas use. So in general, we expect that resources manage the potential financial impact of these limitations through energy bids. If or insofar as there's a physical limit on fuel availability, the ISO expects resources to use adage or derates to reflect that limitation in the market. We are discussing some other approaches to more efficiently manage imbalances as long as those do not represent a reliability risk. And many of the proposals that we've talked about today, like the configurable fuel region multiplier and flexibility when there's more uncertainty day ahead, could potentially improve outcomes during OFO conditions, but we're seeking stakeholder feedback to determine if any of those proposals actually have value in this area so far. Stakeholders recommended 2 additional approaches to provide more efficiency around managing imbalances. The first is to design a constraint in the market that could manage incremental dispatch based on next day nominations. And the second is to come up with a methodology that could reflect the economic and reliability risk of managing OFOs in reference levels. Both of these recommendations represent new market design with some careful considerations that will have to go into it. Before I get to that, I wanted to plug that, so a question we get a lot from stakeholders is, what is a nomogram and how does it relate to this effort? Conceptually, a nomogram is pretty straightforward. It's a grouped constraint that would optimally allocate a limited gas use across impacted resources when it's enforced in binding. In practice, the ISO's gas nomogram constraint that we have today, the operating procedure and the design of it is narrowly defined, and it is narrowly defined to support our FERC approved market rule for SoCalGas and SDG&E. FERC approved the existing procedure for physical constraints that impact gas and electric system reliability under a very specific set of conditions. Nonetheless, so far as it's valuable and applicable, the ISO does support making this specific procedure available to the broader market footprint. There are two takeaways, I think, from the discussion of nomograms in the straw proposal that are important for managing gas system limitations. The first is that the ISO has previously gone to FERC to request that we extend the use of the nomogram to EIM entities, and there are a lot of lessons learned from that effort with indications for the stakeholder recommendation to design a constraint. So tomorrow we're having a workshop which should, where you can learn about some of those prior questions and help set up the question of what do we need to do next if we want to develop a new type of constraint. The second thing that tomorrow's workshop should help you with is to understand the difference between what a nomogram does and how it's currently designed and the expectations around it, and the scenarios that we've heard from stakeholders during the gas resource management working groups. From the ISO's perspective, from what we've learned from stakeholders, the gas nomogram that the ISO currently uses may not meet the specific conditions that we've heard and doesn't necessarily align with the preferred approach that we've heard from stakeholders. But tomorrow's call should give you a better understanding of that and inform how it fits into this process. So in the straw proposal, we haven't moved forward with defining a new market design for the two stakeholder recommendations, the new constraint, and coming up with a methodology for reflecting OFOs and reference levels. But we are proposing, at the very least, a streamlined process for entities that are interested in leveraging a gas nomogram for gas system reliability. We wanted to do this to make sure that all of the ISO's reliability tools, the ISO as a regional market operator, can be extended to any of the market participants across the region. And so we're proposing generalized language in the tariff that would give market participants the ability to leverage this existing design without having to go through a full stakeholder process. This proposal does not modify anything about the existing procedure. What this means is that if the gas nomogram, as it's designed today and as the operational procedure is defined today, doesn't meet your expectations of a preferred solution, then we would have to continue to consider a new policy design and operating procedure and vet those differences in a full stakeholder process. Which brings me to tomorrow. So in tomorrow's workshop, we plan on doing a deep dive into the ISO's expectations around how market participants should behave in the market during periods of gas system limitations. And we're hoping to use this as a jumping off point to identify gaps for existing rules where we need to consider new rules for potentially unique circumstances or unique pipeline policies across the region. We'll do a deep dive into the ISO's gas nomogram constraint, the procedure and the design, and how that would work for regional entities to get your feedback on the proposal and supporting guidelines that we'll use to support this proposal for regulators. Finally, we intend for all of this to help set the stage for continued considerations of the stakeholder recommended tools. So we'll talk a lot tomorrow about the considerations around what it would look like to design a constraint that looks different from the nomogram today, and some of the considerations around what appropriate behavior for updating your reference levels looks like during OFO conditions.
And Sylvie, we do have a hand raised from Stuart Kelly.
Stuart?
Hey, Sylvie, thank you. And I look forward to the discussion on nomograms tomorrow. I'm sure it definitely help, albeit there will be some limitations with the nomogram approach. That said, when considering gas limitations, and CAISO may have done this, but is it possible CAISO can reach out to some of these pipelines or all of the pipelines really and say, look, we need a day, we need a day ahead view or an earlier view of your gas limitations and your OFOs to better help with our gas day ahead planning. I think if we could get that information earlier, that would certainly help, albeit it probably needs to be updated, but I'm sure they've got that information. They just are sticking to this, the timelines when they publish it. Today, they're sticking to that, but I wonder if you asked them, could they bring it forward? I'd be interested in what their reaction would be, and it's probably better coming from CAISO than anyone else.
Stuart, if you are not in tomorrow's workshop, I will make sure to ask this question during that workshop when we have the CAISO's gas ops people there to talk about the type of coordination that we do today and the information sharing that we do today. I'm not the best person to answer that question, but there will be an opportunity to chat about it tomorrow.
Perfect. Thank you, Sylvie. I appreciate it.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
All right. Next steps. So we've gotten through everything that's in the straw proposal in terms of what the ISO is putting on the table for near-term enhancements. Looks like we're missing a slide that I had put in there earlier. So I just wanted to plug that the door is open for ongoing consideration of some of the stakeholder recommendations from earlier in the working group process. For example, a number of stakeholders. Sorry?
You can go to slide 54. I think that's the slide you're looking for. I just lost it.
Aha, yes. Okay. A number of stakeholders recommended this idea of a D+1.5 market run. The idea here was to leverage incrementally more timely information that might be available at that time compared to what information is available at the time of the D+2. At this time, the ISO plans to continue to evaluate the accuracy improvements of the D+2 once we start to implement those. And we'll see what happens after go live. And we'll consider this assessment with stakeholders to make a determination if this is an avenue we should go down. The second proposal I wanted to note is this dynamic market power mitigation for commitment costs. The ISO is also open to considering this down the line. In the past, we have identified a number of implementation challenges with this proposal that has implications for policy itself, which means that if we want to continue to consider this proposal, we'll have to revisit the policy through a stakeholder initiative, which we expect to be resource intensive for stakeholders. So it's on our radar. And as a next step, we will plan to provide stakeholders with more information about what the policy goals and challenges we've identified with this proposal look like. Finally, as we just went through, the idea of developing a constraint that is not a nomogram is still on the table, but I expect that tomorrow's workshop will help clarify some of the challenges and opportunities associated with that. And that's all I've got for you. I'll take a pause to see if there are any questions before handing it over to Christina to close things out.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So I guess I will take over. Thank you, Sylvie. I just have a couple of next steps and announcements before we wrap up for the day. A comment template will be posted shortly, and comments on the straw proposal in today's meeting are due by end of day on August 26th. So please submit your comments on the link here below. Meeting materials are also available on the initiative webpage linked there. And if you have any additional questions that come up, you can always reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And now I just have a couple of announcements before we wrap up for the day. Here you can see market simulation meeting, here you can see our stakeholder meetings for the week, as well as comment submission deadlines, as well as a training at the bottom. And here you can see our market simulation meeting information and details. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see our latest blog posts regarding exploring AI to support smarter grid management. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. And just a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. All meeting materials are available online, and the video file will be posted shortly along with the comment template. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.